Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Communitech Data Hub. Welcome to our online viewers as well. Feel free to continue grabbing sandwiches as I'm talking. I'm just going to do a little introduction before our talk starts. So, can I get a show of hands? Who's here for the first time at a Data Hub session? Okay. And who's been here before? Okay, welcome back to those of you that have been here before. So my name is Jacqueline. I work with Canada's Open Data Exchange, which we call ODX. So ODX is a public-private partnership. We offer a variety of services surrounding open data. So we fund open data-related initiatives. We help individuals and companies locate open data. So if you have any questions about ODX or you're interested in using any of our services, please feel free to reach out to me. I put my email here. You can also talk to me during or after today's session. We also just wanted to make you aware of some career opportunities at the Data Hub. So we've got CIBC is looking for a data scientist co-op student in the Data Hub location, Data Studio. It's just upstairs here. They're also looking for a data scientist in their Toronto location. Kite is looking for they have multiple openings right now, so please feel free to go to their website up here. Skywatch is looking for a platform developer co-op for the summer 2018 term. And Locus Robotics is looking for remote software developers, so feel free to reach out to any of these companies. We also have upcoming Data Hub sessions. We have at least one per month. So we've got Making Sense of Smart Cities with Visualizations on February 7th. And then we've got Joining Multiple Open Data Sets on March 7th. So you can always go to our website if you'd like to know what's coming up next. So now I have the pleasure of introducing today's speaker. This is Willsher. He's our ODX Data Growth Coach. So before ODX, he worked for 12 years as Director of Distribution at the Weather Network. In his spare time, he plays guitar in a rock band, but he's not going to be able to perform for you today, unfortunately. But without further ado, Chris Willsher.
Thank you, Jacqueline. So thank you very much for coming out today to listen to me talk. And for those of you who weren't able to be here in person, thank you for taking time out of your day to listen in. As Jacqueline said, I've spent about 12 years at the Weather Network. And in my role there, I was responsible for creating partnerships with outside companies to provide them with data and give them weather information that they could integrate as part of their own services and their own systems to utilize it in whatever way they were looking to utilize it. So I'm here today to sort of talk to you about how you can go about unlocking your own data and making that available to outside parties so that they can use that information to create new insights, create new services. A lot of companies are creating a lot of new data today, and that's only going to continue to grow. And so there's certainly a lot of opportunity there to look at ways that you can use data in different ways to be able to extend growth. So just kind of a quick agenda for you. I'm going to start off talking a little bit about why you would want to do this. So what are some of the benefits you could potentially reap by extending your data out to third-party companies. Looking at defining your data service. So what are some of the things you need to think about when you are looking to actually start a service like this? There's a number of things there. I'll certainly touch on a number of them. And then a big part of when you're actually creating this type of a service is what your business model is going to be. And that's a big part of it. There's a number of different ways you can do it. And I'm going to touch on some of the more key ones that tend to be fairly common. Talk a little bit about marketing. Certainly traditional marketing is one way to go, but there are some things that you can do from a data service perspective that are maybe a little bit different than what you would do in promoting another product. And then lastly, I'll touch on a few sort of key items that you need to think about when you're going about setting up this type of a service. So let's start off with why. There's a few potential reasons why you may want to open up your data and allow other companies to be able to start utilizing that. First reason I have up here is it could be less work. So if you have a bunch of data and you think about creating that in such a way that it's in a dashboard format that's curated for companies to be able to go in and access that data and look at it, there's a fair bit of development work that's required to ingest that data, create the dashboard, and manage that product. In turn, in most cases, being able to take that data in a raw format and extend that out to people is typically a little less work in terms of a development standpoint. So you save your own development resources some time and effort, especially if the data part is sort of an offshoot of what your main business might be. There's greater flexibility by offering your data to customers. When you provide it to them in a raw format, they can then take that data, they can use it in ways and integrate it with their own systems that makes it a lot more easier for them. They can create probably deeper insights by doing that, by having it in that raw format. And they can also combine it with sources, either their own or other third-party sources, to create new products, services, and insights. Revenue, another perfectly acceptable way. Everybody loves to make money. So you can purely look at it if there's enough value in your data that by offering this out to other companies, it can create a new revenue source for you and allow you to diversify your business. So if you think of an IoT company that is primarily creating a physical product, but a lot of IoT hardware generates a lot of data as well. So this could potentially allow them to diversify their business and not just sell the hardware product, but also go out and sell the data as well and generate additional revenue for their business. And then lastly, you can look at innovation and partnerships. So by unlocking your data and making it available to third parties, in a way it can be like outsourcing your R&D efforts, because what you're doing is you're giving that information to third-party companies, allowing them to play with it, build on it, build services from it, and what that does is it allows them to take the cost and the efforts that are required to actually build those services. And if you have a close connection with these companies, you're able to keep tabs of how things are going, and you can either create a deeper partnership with them or potentially acquire them if the technology or the service that they're creating meshes well with your overall business. So I've included this quote up here. It's from an economist at MIT and Boston University. And I've included it here just because it kind of backs up some of what I talked about in the previous slide. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the term API, stands for Application Programming Interface. And it's a fairly common method of delivering data back and forth. I will touch on it a little bit later in the presentation. But you can see here from this quote that companies that enable APIs do see greater innovation, greater customer satisfaction, because customers are able to use data in ways that is maybe more robust than if it was a lockdown service. And so again, just kind of backs up the point of why you may want to look at opening your data. So when you're defining your service, one of the things you want to think about is ensure that you're thinking about it as a product. Ultimately, that's what this is. It's just a different type of product. And if you take that approach, you'll have a greater chance for being successful. So some of the things that you want to think about when you're defining a data distribution service, first thing is, what data do you have? Obviously very, very important. And doing an inventory of everything that you have available, whether or not you think there may be challenges or restrictions with that data, it's a really good exercise to go through that, because you never know what might come out of the insights that you gain by actually going through and understanding all the data points that you have available within your own servers. The format. So what format is all this data in? If it's in a lockdown proprietary format that only your systems can read, chances are it's not going to be all that easy for other companies to use, because they may not have access to those systems. If it is in a lockdown format, how easy is it to translate it to something that is very easy for other companies to access? It's very machine readable. And so again, that's something that you need to think about, and think about both how you have it, but also how your customers need it as well. Frequency of updates. So how often is this data that you're looking at updated? As an example, if you're collecting traffic data, if that data is only updated once per day, your audience might be a little bit different than if that data is being updated on a very, very regular basis. So if you had a company that was trying to create a real-time traffic flow mobile application, if the data is only updated once a day, it's probably not going to be all that useful for them. However, if you have a company that's maybe trying to develop an algorithm to forecast traffic conditions, maybe that once a day is good enough for them. So, one of the things to think about as you're going through the inventory is thinking about how frequently this is updated, and what availability you would have in terms of being able to deliver that to outside companies. The method of delivery. So I sort of quickly mentioned APIs. APIs is probably one of the more common ways to deliver data. And what it does, you can think about it essentially as just a connection between two entities. And it just allows information to flow back and forth between those two entities very easily in very real-time ways. It also allows the ability for requests to be made, and only being able to send back information based on the request that was made. So it's a much more efficient system than putting everything into a single file and having one download. That being said, sometimes just having everything in a file and downloading it is more than sufficient, and that's sort of what the audience needs, and that's what is easiest for you to be able to deliver. And then lastly on here, data quality. You want to make sure that the information that you are providing is of high quality, it's consistent, it's reliable. If there are holes in that information, it's going to cause challenges for your customers, because if there's a data point in there one time, and then the next update that comes, that data point is no longer there, it potentially can cause problems, especially if that's a really important piece of information that the customer is using. And so you want to make sure that the quality is sort of as consistent and as reliable as it possibly can be. So one of the things that sort of permeated a lot of that, and with any sort of product marketing role, who your target audience is obviously of utmost importance. So as you start thinking about the data that you're looking to offer, you have to start thinking about, well, who potentially would find value in this? And what is it that they need? How do they need it? And in what format do they need it? So this is obviously a very important step as well in terms of defining your service. So I get a little bit into business models now. So when you go about determining your business model, a lot of this is going to connect back to the why statement that I talked about off the top of the presentation. If you're in it for revenue, then absolutely there's going to be some sort of a paid element to it. But your why is really going to drive what your business model will be. One of the things to think about is what the cost of delivering the service. So if you've decided, I've got this data, here's the format I want it in, I want to do it as an API, you have to start adding up all the costs that are associated with actually delivering that service. So there'd be the technical costs in terms of being able to actually set that system up. There would be any administrative costs that you have, so the developers that are required to actually create that service, but then also product management, or marketing people that are involved in that product and pushing that product out. And then as well, just marketing costs. So how are you going to promote the service, and what elements do you need to include in order to be able to deliver that service and to be able to promote that service? Last point on here, levels of openness. So how open do you want to make this data? You can, much like what government is doing, make it widely available. It's free on a website. You can come and download it. You don't have to do anything at all in order to be able to access that information. That's certainly one level. You can make the data openly available, but have some form of a registration there that people have to leave an email address and some contact information. And what this does is even though the data may be free for companies to go out and use, you still have the ability to keep track of who's actually using that data and potentially finding out how they're using that data as well. So it gives you that ability to keep that communication going. And the last one would be sort of closing it down. And this would basically be putting a page up to say, we've got this data available, contact us to learn more about it. So essentially, individuals would need to reach out and contact a gatekeeper at your company in order to progress at all in terms of being able to actually use any information. So the first business model that I have up here is where the developer pays. And this is obviously a revenue generating one. Some of the things you need to keep in mind is what the going market rate is. So if the data that you're looking to provide to an audience, if there are other companies out there that are offering similar types of data, if there's ways that you can find out what they're charging for it, obviously that's helpful because it begins to help you understand what you can potentially charge. Obviously, if there's companies out there that are charging $200 for this data, you can't necessarily go into the market and charge $3,000. Well, you could, but you may have less chance of being successful with doing that. What's the value in the data that you're offering? So, how much does the target audience see value in what it is that they're gaining access to? Again, that's going to play a role in terms of how much you're going to be able to charge for that information. How do you go about charging? So I've got 3 models here. By no means, I don't think this is an exhaustive list, but these tend to be the most common ways to charge for data. So the first one is a flat fee. So basically you charge $1,000 a month or $1,000 a year or a one-time subscription of $1,000, and companies can go in and they can access that data and use it however they want for whatever time period they want. This would obviously work well if you've got one data file that people are going and downloading and able to use. Doesn't work so well if you've got an API product, because you're going to have companies that are going to be accessing this API on a regular basis. So you're going to have high volume customers that you're probably going to lose money on, and then you're going to have low volume customers that are probably going to question why they're paying so much when they're not using as much of the data that is available. There's tiered pricing, and this one tends to be fairly common within the API space. So this is the data costs X number of dollars for X number of events. Typically, it's the number of calls that are made to an API. This one works well within the API space because what it does is it gives cost certainty for the end user. So they know that, okay, I think we're going to have this much amount of traffic to the API. We're going to fall within this tier, and they'll know month after month that that's where we're going to be, and that, okay, if our traffic does increase, well, we also know what the next tier up is going to be. So it allows them to sort of plan and build around some fairly consistent cost numbers. On the downside, you as a distributor need to think about what's going to happen in the event that a customer goes over the tier. So, does the API, like if you've got a customer and they're on 1,000 calls per month and they get to 1,001, does the API just automatically shut off? Is there a percentage that the customer is allowed to go over their calls in a given time period? Those are some things that you need to consider as well in terms of employing that type of a paid model. And then the last one is basically a per event. It's similar to the tiered approach, except there are no tiers. It's basically here's what the cost is per call, and however many calls you make over the course of the month, that's basically what you pay at the end of the month, and you would get an invoice. So again, very similar. Bit of a flip side in terms of the benefits and downsides of it. Obviously, there's less cost certainty for the end user because it'll all be based on how much traffic they're sending to it. On the distributor side, there's no need to think about the tiers that, or think about the overage for the tiers that would be put in place. So freemium is often an option that's available within a lot of paid models. And what this is just a free tier that allows developers to go in and play around with the data. And it's actually great because the stat up here, developers are actually 3 times more likely to pay for a data service if there's a free tier available. What it does is essentially just allows them to go in, test it out, sort of build a proof of concept, and then once they're at a point where they can start to deploy that into the market, at that point they would come back and say, okay, we want to bump up into a paid tier because we now need more traffic to the API. And one of the things to think about here is a lot of times companies will hold internal hackathons or other types of development events. And so when developers are given the time to kind of go and explore and come up with new ideas, they may be on the hunt for some things that they want to include, and they'll go out and seek out some data or seek out an API. And if there's that developer tier, it allows them to go in, play with something, build a proof of concept, show it to the product team, and then the product team may really like that idea and decide to implement it. To give you a real-life example, I'm sure there's probably some Facebook users around here. A number of years ago, Facebook implemented weather on their events page, and that's exactly how that product actually got rolled out. It was an internal hackathon that was done, and they really liked the idea and decided to actually implement it. So you never know where opportunities are going to come. So even if you are putting a paid model, this is something that's definitely recommended, especially if you're taking an API approach. In terms of enabling limits within a freemium environment, there's a few different ways you can do it. Probably the most common way to do it is actually by limiting the number of calls that are made to an API. That's probably most API products out there, that's what you would see. However, there are some other ways you can go about doing it. It could be a limit in terms of the format of the data that's available. So if you think about a Getty Images, maybe that you are given access in a free tier to a very low-res version, maybe has a watermark associated with that image. So it's not extremely usable, but it's enough to be able to test the service and understand how it's going to work. And then once you get to a point where you actually want to start deploying this in a real-life scenario, you would go back and actually start paying for the data. The other thing to think about, sorry. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So this is a site called Full Contact. And what they do is they actually provide profile information. So you can see here they've got their free tier, and then as soon as you get beyond the 100 matches per month, which is the metric that they use for measuring their API, you start to pay. And you can see up on the premium tier, there's some additional support services that are added to it as well. So as you start to move up the chain, then you begin to get some additional service on top of it. Dark Sky is a weather API, and they take a per event approach to their API. So you can see that there's a fee for every call that's made. You get the first 1,000 calls per day for free, and then everything after that, the clock starts ticking on the costs that you would pay. And so there's no limit. You kind of keep going until you've reached whatever time period that they define for their their pricing, and then you would get an invoice based off of how much you used. So opening up your data, there's a few reasons why you might want to think about doing this. Potentially it's an overcrowded market. So coming from the weather space, there was more than 200 weather APIs available. There's a number of them that were free. A number of others that charged, in the initial tiers were $10 or $15 a month. So there wasn't a ton of revenue to really be made off of it. So if you're in that type of a market, you may decide, well, you know what, I'm just going to make data freely available, and maybe I will look for marketing opportunities to use that data. So whether it's attribution that you're gaining or some other sort of marketing benefit out of it. There could be social benefit to it. There might be an environmental cause or a health cause. By opening up this data and making it available to others, it may help them in terms of advancing the solutions to whatever the issue may be. As an example, the Ontario Brain Institute actually recently opened up data to help the explore research within autism. So that's kind of an example of where you may want to look at opening data if it is going to help further the cause, and especially if there's some benefit that you can derive from that as well. You could open the data up as a loss leader to other services. So you provide the data, but you have consulting services or visualization services that you can sell to the customers that are using the data, and allow them to sort of begin buying and accessing those services at a paid rate. And then, as I mentioned off the top, you can potentially outsource your R&D efforts. So you're providing this information, allowing people to go and play and create new products and services, and then being able to reap the benefits of what they're building and creating. So I don't know if anybody's familiar with a site called Open Corporates. Basically what they do is they collect information on companies around the world. And they have a site that you can search for this information, and they also make an API available. And with the API, they use what's called a share-alike license. And this came out of the Creative Commons rise in terms of open source and open information. So essentially what that is they will make the data available for free. You can go and use it, but whatever you create has to also be made open. If you decide that what I've created I don't want to make available on an open basis, I want to keep it as a commercial entity or a proprietary entity, then you would go to Open Corporates and you would negotiate a fee for actually using that data. So they've kind of taken their approach where they're big open data proponents, and what they're trying to do is just continue to propel forward that open data movement. Another reason why you might want to open your data is discoverability. So you see the examples here of Walgreens and Best Buy. They actually make their store location available via an API, and it's freely available. There's a good reason to do this, because there's sites out there like Yellow Pages and Yelp that are directory services for a number of different retail location businesses. For them to be able to tap into this API, they're able to actually get the most recent up-to-date store location information into their site as well. And it's a benefit for the business because if I'm a customer and I'm using Yelp to go and find a location, and the information is out of date, and maybe the location is closed down, but it's still on their site, obviously if I go to that location and it's not there, it becomes a bit of a disappointment for the customer. So if you have retail locations, this is certainly something to think about. In addition, Best Buy actually has all the product listing and a bunch of other information that they make available that people can use and integrate as part of their platforms. So a couple of things with regards to licensing. Probably most importantly, just make sure you own the rights to all your data, especially if you are taking data from an external source and incorporating that as part of your own, and then that creates a sort of a new data source. You just want to make sure that whoever that third party is, that you actually have the rights to be able to create that data and then redistribute that data. If you don't, it would be not really good if you start distributing that data, they find out that you're using their data and come after you and tell you to shut down the service after you've already launched it. So definitely make sure you do your due diligence, probably within a data inventory standpoint, to understand what are the licensing rights that are associated with all the data points that you have. Privacy issues, obviously everybody's aware that privacy and personal information is a huge issue these days. So any of the information that you are looking to make available, just make sure that it is not going to infringe upon any personal information that of your customers or any other sort of personal information laws out there. And keep in mind that privacy laws are different from various regions around the world. So whatever markets that you're looking to be involved in, you just want to make sure that you're not going to infringe upon any of the privacy rights within those regions. And then lastly is defining your own terms of use. So what restrictions do you want to put on your customers using the data service that you're providing? And one thing you want to keep in mind here is that you don't want to make it too restrictive, because the more restrictions you put on customers, the more barriers you're actually creating for them to be able to go out, actually use this data in ways that they want to use it. So keep that in mind as you're doing it. Try and keep it, obviously ensure that you're protected and that anything that you're offering is going to be covered off, but also provides enough flexibility for developers to be able to do what they want to do with it. So I'll get a little bit into promoting your data service. Probably one of the most important things to think about when you are putting this out there is creating a developer portal. So essentially what this is just a page within your website or its own website on its own that allows any developer to come in, find your service, and either be able to access the service or find out more information for getting a hold of the information that you're making available. There's a number of different things you can potentially incorporate as part of this in terms of forms. You can have all your sign up so that developers can go in and register for the data right away. Probably the most important thing out of this entire list, though, is documentation. That's probably one of the biggest things within this space, and I think any developer would tell you that the better the documentation is, the easier it makes it for them to be able to go out and start implementing the data. So if you're putting in place an API product, how do you go about making an API call? Give them full details in terms of making that happen. As well, you also want to ensure that you define all the data parameters that are included within whatever service it is that you're offering. The one thing you don't want to have happen is a developer comes in, they find the data, and they look at it, and either they look at it and go, okay, I have no idea what this parameter actually means or this data actually means and what it represents, and they just decide not to use it. Or they take it and they start using it thinking it means one thing, but it actually means something else. So whatever product they're building or whatever insights they're generating off of it are going to be incorrect. So you want to try and avoid that as much as possible. So definitely provide them with as much information as you can. Developer relations is another important aspect to it. It's another way to kind of get your service out in front of the development community. One thing you can look at doing is creating your own dedicated social media accounts for your data service. So this is a way that you can communicate with the community on a regular basis, provide them with news about maybe some updates that are coming to the service. If God forbid there's an outage for your service, it's again another way to communicate those important pieces of information as well. And it gives the opportunity for them to also give feedback to you. You can be involved in developer events and hackathons. Again, another great way to get the development community starting to play with it. You could either establish your own and develop your own events, or you can sponsor and be a part of a larger event like Hack the North that's done here in Waterloo. And sponsor an event like that. Potentially you can offer prizing for the best use of the data within the projects that are done within the course of the hackathon. But it's definitely a great way to be able to get people using the data, get them used to the service, and get them further involved in terms of the development community. You may want to look at hiring a developer relations manager or an evangelist. So this is somebody that would be a liaison with the development community, would help them solve any problems that they have in terms of accessing the data or using the service, and also be able to provide feedback to your own organization in terms of what the development community is saying about the service that you're offering. And then lastly, GitHub, another great resource for reaching this community. So if you have the service out there and you find that there's either common things that developers are doing with the information, you can maybe create your own code snippets that you can incorporate up here that, again, makes it easier for developers to go out and actually start using the service. And that's the biggest thing you want to do, is just reduce those barriers to entry as much as possible to get them up and running with it and get them using the data. There are a few API directories and marketplaces out there as well. One of them is called Rapid API. It's actually a bit more of a platform that allows content creators to be able to set up an API and easily distribute that out to outside companies. And it also makes it easier from a developer standpoint because it's kind of a one-stop shop for accessing a number of different APIs. It is a commercial-based model, so what they do is they actually take a percentage of whatever the API creator actually sells. So if you do have a paid model and you're going through this, just keep in mind that there is going to be a percentage taken off of whatever you make off of it by going through this. But they do have a fairly robust marketplace, and they actually just recently merged with another similar platform called Mashape. So they've become even bigger than they previously were. Programmable Web is a news and information site around the API community, and they have a fairly robust API directory. Last time I checked, I think there were over 19,000 APIs listed in this, so it's quite a wealth of information. It is essentially a self-service directory, though, so data providers would go in and input their information as part of this, and they would have to keep it up to date. So the downside of their directory is that you often find listings in there where the service is no longer available, so links are broken and whatnot. But it is one of the few sort of resources out there in terms of finding APIs and being able to quickly discover APIs that are available. So a few other considerations to take into account when you are in the midst of trying to create a data service. One of the first things is to think about how you're going to version your service. So if you are creating an API, obviously you're not going to create it, go, okay, work done, and leave it at that. You're probably going to want to continue to improve upon it, add new data to it, add new services to it. So when you roll out version 2, what are you going to do in terms of making that available? You want to ensure that anybody that's currently using it, you're not going to break whatever it is that they're doing with it, because then they now have to scramble and kind of repair whatever changes were made in order to get their services back up and running. Even if you're providing a one-time download, something to keep in mind in terms of where that data file is located. If you have it in a particular location on your website, if you go and change that location, it makes it difficult for development companies to go and find that data again. And some companies may actually set up a process that goes and regularly pings that location and grabs the latest data file to ensure that they have the most up-to-date information. So again, if you change that, it's going to break their systems, and it's going to cause them work, and they're going to have to scramble to try and fix it and get things set up again so that they can continue to access that information. Having a back-end portal is also very important, especially if you have an API. This is essentially where you would be able to see all the customers that have come in and registered for your service. It's also a way that you can manage the overall use of your API and use by individual accounts, and be able to turn on and off systems. So it gives you that ability to manage who's using your data at any given time. Security is, again, another key item to think about. You want to ensure that there's no unauthorized use of the information. You've gone to all this trouble to sort of set up this program. You don't want people to go in and access this information that maybe shouldn't be accessing it. So if you've got an API program, there's API keys and OAuth that you can use as security measures just to help lock your service down. And then from a one-time download standpoint, there's some things as well you can do, but certainly think about security as another element when you're putting your data service in place. And then lastly, like any good product, you want to ensure that you're measuring performance. So again, going back to why you're doing this, think about how you're going to actually measure the results, and are you achieving what it is that you want to achieve with this service? So make sure that you think about these metrics, set up some reporting and set up some benchmarks to be able to measure how you're actually going to go about understanding what is the benefit, and am I reaching the benefit that I wanted to reach with regards to the data service that I'm offering up. And yes, that wraps it up. A lot of information in a very short span of time, but I hope that gives you a bit of an overview in terms of a number of things to think about when you are creating a data service. I think we have a little bit of time left, so happy to take any questions that anyone may have and answer those as well. I've got my contact information up here. So if you'd like to reach out and talk further, by all means, feel free to connect. And I'd be happy to chat further about how we can go about helping you in terms of creating a data service. Yeah, I think you would need to, much like any sort of startup business, is just, look at what the market is and potentially approach a handful of companies that are within that target audience, and just go out and have conversations with them in terms of, what is the value that you see in this? Especially if you're in an instance where maybe there aren't providers that are offering the type of data that you have available. So, ultimately, I think it's really sort of taking that startup approach and that interest, and just kind of understanding, who the market is in terms of the data that you have. Thinking about, okay, I think this market potentially could be something that would see value in having access to this type of information, and then reaching out to a handful of companies to talk to them and sort of digging a little deeper in terms of what they think might be available. But in terms of any sort of special approach to looking at a data service, I don't really think there's no generalized research or stats that have been published. Yeah, that's the one thing about this area, is that there really isn't a lot of stats and research behind it. It is a bit of a new area. It's been done to a certain extent for a little while, but there's certainly been a lot of growth in this area over the last little while. So I suspect that we'll probably see some more stats and things come out. Like the quote that I had up on there earlier, I'd never seen anything like that before in any of my travels. So it is a fairly new area, so it's a little bit of a Wild West, and ultimately I think it's going to come down to, if this is something that you want to pursue, it's just carving out a little bit of resource within your company to go out, start exploring it, start understanding it, and just try and validate, is there enough of a market there for us to then go out and actually build this out on a large scale basis. Yep.
Who's done a good job in delivering data and for a revenue-based data?
Sorry, pardon me?
Which company's done or organization's done a really great job in data distribution for revenue?
In terms of who's done a really good job, not having, I haven't seen any stats in terms of here's the companies that have done really well. Because a lot of these products are really closed down, there's nothing out there. There's a number of companies out there that have really built businesses around that. You could see the example that I put up there, Full Contact, has essentially built a business around creating data products that allow people to sort of access the database of information that they have. I don't have any specific stats though in terms of, here's sort of the top companies that have generated revenue out of it. Even based on data distribution. The programmable website is about the only news and information site out there. And in terms of companies that are out there, I know there's definitely a lot of them that are certainly putting paid models around it. Coming from the weather background, pretty much every major weather provider has some form of an API, and have had them for a number of years. I don't know exactly what it is that they're making.
Not necessarily an API, but data distribution for revenue. You have some free models up there?
Yes.
Yeah. Which companies have done a great job?
So, I think from my standpoint, as I said, Full Contact seems to be doing a fairly good job with it. But again, I don't know. I haven't seen anything in terms of, here's the top revenue generating data distribution businesses.
Yeah, that's what I want to know.
Yeah, I haven't seen any sort of stats out there that say, here's the top companies that have built businesses generating revenue from distributing data. So, as I had mentioned earlier, unfortunately, it is still a fairly new area, and there isn't a ton of information out there like that that there would be in more established industries. So hopefully we'll get there at some point.
Sure.
Yes.
Do you know is there anyone out there building like a data broker service where instead of just maybe at Marketplace, we could sell data to the carrier and they could find, they could figure out how to sell it to the organization?
Sorry, you have to excuse me.
What I'm wondering is there such a thing out there as a data broker? Not like an API Marketplace where we post our API data, but where we can sell our data to like one central service who can then, resell it.
There isn't one that I'm familiar with. As I said, there's sort of the directories and the API platforms that are available up there.
It really varies by vertical as well. So in financial services and legal, Thomson Reuters does a lot of that. In news, there are a number of them that are they tend to be industry specific, and the relationships are generally really direct. So I think it's a longer conversation that Thomson Reuters probably would talk to. But there's a long history of people
Okay. Thank you very much.